Good morning and welcome to sunny Manchester, where today I, Tim Warneford, will be chairing the latest roundtable event on why fabric first. What are the advantages of applying a fabric first strategic estate strategy? So it's important to discover whether it's possible that we can extrapolate from the features and benefits as evidenced from the single Sutton Coldfield Grammar School for Girls 5-year capital programme. Is it possible to extrapolate that into a wider, perhaps DFE funded, sponsored approach towards good estate management for schools by adapting a fabric first approach?
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. I know there was lots of competition out there and I understand that some of you even found it a bit of a struggle to find us, but that's what comes with being on the fringe, I suppose. Fringe, see cult, and the respective viewing numbers are accorded to that. However, just like poetry, we're the important things out there. Once again, thanks for coming. Over the next hour or so, this session is kind of here to review and assess the strategy of fabric first. We're going to use the micro example of a 5-year fabric first strategy applied to Sutton Coldfield Grammar School for Girls, and we're going to tease out the process and the wins that have come from that. And my panellists here are going to talk about and contribute what they added to that. So let me introduce the panellists first. So from the client side, Doug Thorp, COO, I think, if I'm correct, of Sutton Coldfield Grammar School for Girls. He's going to obviously give you an insight to the client's experience, the wins and losses and the rest of the journey. He'll be followed by Steve Bolt of BCR Associates. Steve's going to talk about the energy procurement pitfalls and successes that he managed to, along with Doug, navigate and secure for the trust, and also why energy procurement has a very close relationship with your decarb strategy as well. They are not separate, they need to be linked together. After that, James Smurthwaite of Green Net Zero will be talking about just that, the opportunity schools have to reduce their energy and carbon costs. And finally, we will have Dr. John Whittle, Director of My Carbon, who again will discuss, by 2025, all schools are due to have a climate action plan, John, aren't they? We don't know whether that's the 1st of January or the 31st of December, but nonetheless, at some stage during that year, they are currently charged with basically producing one. So that's going to kind of be the order of play. So for me, my focus on why fabric first, the National Audit Office themselves, that last year's report, it clearly makes it sensible that we are effectively £3 billion behind what we effectively need just to deal with the condition of our estate. So we currently get about 2.3 billion. Obviously, the lion's share of that coming via SCA and the rest of it via CIF. So we currently get 2.3 billion, and it's estimated we need at least 5.3 billion. And therefore, it's no surprise that we're effectively circa 15 billion pounds behind in terms of just addressing the condition needs of our school estate, a sizable sum. That is without the figures that are going to be involved in terms of the school rebuilding programme, the rack replacement works as well. The numbers are just obviously starting to get relatively high. We have effectively a legacy of underinvestment, but we also need to start thinking about how we're going to future-proof our route to net zero. We've got effectively 25 years to get there, and if you just work on the average of another 2 billion a year over 25 years, all of a sudden we're at north of 7 billion pounds that's going to be required to address our school condition and our decarb routes. So there's a sizable challenge ahead. Obviously, we're currently hearing from Sir Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Bridget Phillipson, etc. And hopefully the school estate will be deemed as part of that wider infrastructure project in terms of them relaxing fiscal rules, and that we will benefit from that, because surely the school estate has to qualify as vital infrastructure. Surely it has to, doesn't it, in terms of our future of children and of our economy. So obviously I think we're all waiting with bated breath in terms of what will be announced in the budget, because thus far of late there's been a dearth of comms from the DfE in terms of exactly what's going to go on. No one knows, and I know that from all of the different types of projects that I work across, whether that is RAC, school rebuilding, SIF, SCA. And so the next couple of weeks I think are going to be really important. And given the political capital that Labour quite rightly used in terms of criticisms of the former administration and in terms of their lack of investment, it's kind of now time for them to walk the walk a bit, isn't it, really? And I think that's what we're all going to be looking forward to. I kind of want to make the case for Fabric First. And one of the things that I've just alluded to is that at the moment we are challenged with assessing and improving our school condition in terms of the buildings. But as I said, we've also got to look at decarb. And at the moment, the funding streams that are available for schools to access, they're siloed, they're fragmented. There is no joined up thinking here, and therefore we today are going to potentially posit that one way of securing an outcome in advance is to say if we were to adapt a Fabric First approach, we would be able to address both the condition and the decarb, because surely we have to note that they are inextricably linked, aren't they? There's absolutely no point putting decarb ahead of condition. You'd just be wasting your money, and you'd be wasting your clients' money, because we should not be putting in certain renewables in buildings which aren't fit for purpose. So if we accept that we want the same outcome, good conditioned buildings and ones that are fit for purpose, that can produce a return on investment for both cost, from energy savings and carbon savings, why are we not looking at the two things together? Why could we not have a more strategic, coordinated strategy about that? And again, I know we're jumping from the singular to the universal and back again, specific to it. We want to use the Sutton Coldfield example of what wins can be secured by following a Fabric First approach. The obvious thing is that if you deal with your building envelope, you'll be making it structurally sound and weatherproof, watertight, which obviously has implications in terms of materials such as RAC, funnily enough, but I don't think there are too many other materials out there that particularly benefit from long-term water ingress either. So it doesn't matter whether it's a RAC deck, it could be a Stramit or a wood wall deck, they're equally going to be vulnerable to collapse if that fabric is not addressed. And the list goes on. Obviously, if you are not fixing your roof while the sun shines, there will be additional costs that you're likely to end up being hit by, because they could affect electrical circuits as well as other structural joists, etc., let alone down to the more prosaic plasterwork and decoration. But it clearly makes sense. Anyone who's in the business of asset management will want to make sure that their building envelope is waterproof and structurally sound. Obviously, by addressing that, you would also insulate your buildings. Therefore, you're going to provide greater thermal comfort to your stakeholders, to your pupils, to your staff, etc. But there are other advantages that come from that. There will be cost savings, carbon savings. And finally, the other, which is where we tie it all back, is that if you do adapt to a Fabric First approach, and if you have insulated your building envelope, providing, again, one little caveat, providing you do have both internal and external infrastructure in terms of decent supply of electrical supply, you can then, as part of your wider options appraisal, when you're replacing your heating and boiler systems, you can obviously include things like air source heat pumps, which you would not be able to do if you haven't fixed the building envelope. And any client now that specifies a like-for-like gas boiler is effectively going to condemn that building to having gas for another 15 years. And therefore our successors, those people that are going to follow us, that are going to have the responsibility for managing that estate and transitioning towards net zero, will be left with barely a decade to address it. So we have a duty of care to try and do what we can now, even if that's a hybrid system, even if that's just making that little step, just that slightly little bit easier for those that are going to follow us afterwards. So that for me is why I think that this case study is really important, and there will be flaws in it. There will be arguments against it. Of course there will be, and none least through the particular funding stream that we were successful with under SIF. That may not be applicable to those SCA-funded larger trusts. But nonetheless, I think as a methodical approach, it's pretty good, and we're happy to sort of argue with anyone in here who wants to sort of disprove that. So I'm now going to start introducing the clients. You're going to hear from Doug first, because he will be representing what the client's journey's been like, and that therefore, regardless of what I say in terms of theory, it's far better to hear the actual practice on the ground and in terms of the successes and the wins that we've had. So if you can come up, Doug, and give us your story. So thank you very much.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. So what's my story? So before I came to schools, I worked in local government as an accountant, went through the university sector, and in 2019 I came across a job at Sutton Coldfield Grammar School for Girls, applied for it, and little did I know, here I started the job. So the finance element of it, familiar with that, relatively small business compared to what I worked in before. There was another section of my job title, Operations Director. What on earth does operations mean? It is, it's a very wide remit, all the way from stories where I had to go out and collect sandwiches for catering, security. And one day I'm sitting there in the head's office and we're beginning to, explore about, what are the outside financing? What are the key things they need doing? And you look out the head's window, there's a big hole in the roof on the far side. It's like, ooh, the roof's 90 years old. It's never been replaced. Then we talk about the previous winter when there've been issues with the heating, with boilers failing. It's like, ooh, okay. So what the school had done the previous 10 years since it became an academy, it spent probably about £3 million or so on 2 flashy new buildings. But what it hadn't done was invest in that key infrastructure. So one of the first things I set about doing in the summer of 2019 was get a building condition survey. I'd never heard of this term before. So anyway, went out and got one, spoke to some suppliers, and it came back and actually found, the electrics need some work. Boilers, they're 40 years old. Comes to the end of life. Then some other factors come up, and it's like thinking, this is multi-million pounds. As a school, we were not a poor school, but what we didn't have is those millions of pounds worth of reserves in there. It'd all been pumped into new buildings, and then got the challenge of, right, how are we going to fund this? And I went to a conference similar like this down in Birmingham and got speaking to some people, and this is how I got put in contact with Tim, because I was like, right, roof, and I went to Poly, I can't remember the name of the company now, Poly something, and they put me in contact with Tim. And by the time I got home about 5 o'clock, Tim was already on the phone to me, and we were talking about, what can we do? This was November. The first SIF deadline was about 3-4 weeks later. So Tim had a lot of work to do to try and get a bid in. But then when we're thinking there, I've got this building condition survey. What do we need to do? One of the first things you've got to do is we've got to get a dry building. If you haven't got a dry building, you can have problems all over the place with repairs. So we set about doing a roof bid. We were also working at the time on electrics. We needed to replace some 40 distribution boards that were probably older than what I was. I'm 45 older now, 43 now. I imagine those distribution boards dated back to the 1970s or even 1960s. So we set about doing that. But then you're thinking, right, okay, well, where are we going longer term? Where are the other issues? And you look at this building condition survey, then it's like a problem with the boilers. And I remember as we went into COVID, Boris put us in lockdown, out of lockdown, in lockdown, out of lockdown. And the one after Christmas, I got to school on the Monday morning. In one of the buildings, probably about 20% of the floor of the school, the boilers are packed up. It's like, great. If we had, and at that point in the day, it's like the school was going to be open the next day, then the day went on, actually schools were closed. It's like, oh, great. I don't need to get the boiler working tomorrow. And, I think the repair was, again, a few £1,000s. So as I was going through those first few months, there was repairs needed going all over the place. We were also trying to look at doing a new build, but actually you've got to get your foundations sorted first. If you haven't got your foundations sorted, there's no point in trying to do the new build. So we set about, we looked at the roof, and there's probably 3 or 4 different elements needed doing to that roof. We had the flat roof, and we had a very big pitch roof over the building. And speaking with Tim, we set about, let's do the flat roof. We've got a few weeks, we can do that, get that in, put the bid in, with a lot of work between me and Tim, photographs, evidence, etc., just building that data, that case study for that. Then on that, it's like, the roof, then Tim came to me with the bad news, the roof can't be done in 6 weeks. What do you mean the roof can't be done in 6 weeks? Well, it's a big blooming roof, Doug. Covers, a building that's probably like about 4,000 or 5,000 square meters. Like, oh, okay, well, what is it? Is it a 10-week program? No, it's a 2-year program. 2 years, 2 years of scaffolding it around the school. Yes, and it's 2 bids. Oh, and how much is all this going to cost? Then we started around about 500k, then we got more details across the 2 bids. I think in the end it came to over £1 million of roof work, and that's like, oh, okay. So anyway, so we set about that. So that was around about 21, 22. Then I was aware of the boilers. So you can do 2 SIF bids a year. So we did the 2. So I think 2021, I've got it right, or 20. I can't remember which way around it was. No, 2020 we put 2 bids in. One for the first pitch roof, and one for the boilers. Of course, then the announcements came out in June. How are we going to set about replacing a roof at 2 weeks' notice when all the supply chains messed up, etc., etc. So we set about the boilers, worked with the company there, Hockley, did a great job. Then with the roof, we managed to defer it for a year. But then with deferring for a year, it's like, okay, so well, what else do we need to get moving on? Second roof bid. But actually, hold on a minute. Should we be trying to do 2 roof bids at the same time? Well, we set about, and we started work on the first roof bid, and I think that was 2021. So we then did the second one, which I think we did in 2023, if memory serves. And also, when we did the second roof one, we also set about doing the boilers. So nothing like 2 big projects going on. What's crossover? Well, one's outside, one's inside. It'll all be fine. Well, I had full head of hair at the time. But no, we set about doing that. And with the new boilers, we then began to have the impact of looking at our energy consumption. Our energy consumption was beginning to fall. Not just fall, it was nosediving. Once the boilers were complete, one had a robust heating system. So when the students came in, we know that the heating was going to work. I wasn't have to go to the head and say, we've got to close the school because the heating was going to work. But the heating, our gas consumption fell like about 42% over 5 years. I was like, why? Why is that the case? Well, we've got a new roof with insulation. We've got energy monitoring software, which allowed us to actually, like, why we got the heating on a Saturday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning when nobody's in. And obviously we had these new boilers, which admittedly were gas. It was just before the SIF went down the, I suppose, more green route. But I was also aware that I've got a building here that is very old. And do I want to be in heats or air source heat pumps in when I wasn't convinced about where they were? But anyway, so I managed to get the gas ones in. And then we've got robust heat systems. So I'm then thinking, great, we come to the end of the refurb. Then another problem rears its head. Asbestos around leaking pipes. So November 22, we had a leak downstairs in the voids, which nobody had been down probably for like 15 years. It's like, can we just lift up? No, you can't go down there because of asbestos. So basically we had to, I think for about 3 months, we had to use a whole load of electric heaters as we had heating wiped out to whole swathes of the building. And we got repair come through, and it was a couple of leaks on pipe. Just repairing the pipes itself was probably about £3,000, but by the time you factor in asbestos, the electric heaters, and all the other mitigation we had to go, it was like £30,000. It's like, this is a lot of money. But what it did do was give us a good core evidence base to go and do our final SIF project around replacing the pipe work. So we put that in autumn just gone, and again we were successful. Again, but I think part of that is around getting that key evidence in place, not rushing it last minute. We were working on it probably from the February of 23 to submission in 24. In autumn 23. So a good 9-10 month lead period in. But we had all the evidence then. We put the bid in, but it was like over £1 million. But then we started work on that in May, and we just come to the end of it now. So hopefully that should be complete by Christmas. But what I've got now is a sound, robust building. We've done a lot of the key elements that need to be in place. So we can now think about actually what's the next step. Well, we've got 2 next steps on what we're looking to do. One is down the green agenda. So we've done a lot on our, I suppose, moving towards net zero. We've still got loads to go. We've done the gas work, but we've now got to look at our electricity. How can I get my electricity to fall by 42% is the challenge. So our gas cost now is back at where it is at 2018-19, not because of the unit price, but because of the usage. So where we were paying out £40,000 in 18-19, we're back in 24-25 to paying 40,000. Through the, if I recall, through when we had the UK spike, it went up to 122,000. So there's actually 80,000 pounds. If you use that as a benchmark, we've saved. We can reinvest in hiring of a teacher, etc., or we can put it towards other stuff. So if I can do the same with electricity, where our bill's £100,000 a year, if I can get that down to £50,000 again, there's some great things we can do on that side. So my state strategy now is beginning to look at moving, I suppose, two strands. One is the green agenda, so working with a couple of people in front of me here to look at our solar panels. How much can we reduce that by? Is it going to cover its own cost? Can I generate multi-thousand pounds, tens of thousands of pounds worth of savings? Well, that's something we're examining at the moment. But then also through the money we've saved and also the money we've had coming through SIF, we've got significant reserves now, which we can look at investing into a new building. So one of the things we've got is our sixth form experience is not very good. We're a leading academic institution, but our sixth form spaces, they're all over the shop. They'll be in the dining hall, they'll be in the main hall, they'll be in a very small common room. We need to modernise that. So through all the external funding we've had come through from SIF and the savings we generated each year, we now can look at this new build. So that is something we're beginning to advance ourselves onto. Another thing I wrote down is, in terms of knowing what I know now, what would have I told myself all those years ago? One, I wouldn't have believed we've achieved what we have done. We've done 7 SIF bids and won 7 SIF bids, which I think is almost an amazing record in itself. But that's been through diligent data and working with trusted partners, not just going with any old person, doing that due diligence, working, speaking to several suppliers, and you begin to get a feel. So that thing around integrity, that trusted relationships, also growing in experience. I was an accountant, as I started off by saying. Operations director, what on earth does that mean? Well, I know what that means now, and it's more than doing sandwich runs. Also, learn as well. I mean, this morning I learned the thing around energy, the scope 3. Well, I only first heard that 6 weeks ago. So that's something we'll be working towards over time. And also plan. You can't do all this in 1 year. It takes time. My state strategy, what it was now compared to what it was 3 years ago, is evolving. 3 years ago, I didn't really have an environmental aspect in it. Well, as the DfE is now saying, we need that climate action sustainability plan. So beginning to build that through. So from there, and also expect the unexpected. I mean, the pipes bursting below ground surrounded by asbestos was unexpected. Plus, with the school estate, there's always something else. I've had another problem rear its head in the last 24 hours, but I'll share you that. Oh, I won't share that with you. And also take the board with you. We all have governors in school. Take them on the journey, outlay, and, have those discussions. And sometimes it might be tough. It's like, why can't you do this? Because it's not proven. You've got to go down this route, and this is what the expert says. Okay, any questions, or I'll hand over to Steve, who has... Oh, yep.
Interested in the savings that you generate, and the extent to which you're able to invest those in future schemes. Don't they take the money back off you if you make it in the same? Your budget's held the same, and any savings that you make, you could...
Well, in terms of savings, it's on our revenue day-to-day budget. So when we take our two areas, it's our maintenance, so that's fallen from about 110k a year down to about 70,000. Also our gas, again, fallen from 80,000 to 40,000. The government put, I suppose, a lot of a couple of grants in place to help fund the energy. Well, they never took that back, so it was day-to-day revenue funding. So yeah, that is money we have been able to drop to the bottom line.
Yeah, okay, good to hear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Our sort of involvement with Tim and working with Doug really started back in 2020, and my business actually looks after energy management, and part of the business actually has a large broking arm in the procurement side, and what Tim said at the start is really critical. When you're looking to save money, when you're looking to actually reduce energy consumption on site, its integral part of it is the contract. Contract is sacrosanct, because ultimately you can end up thinking you're making a saving. If the contract isn't right, you will not make a saving. Energy companies actually have, and in the commercial world, typically 4 different contracts that they will have. Every provider has them. And it's really important to understand what one you've got and what penalties are in there and what things are in there to protect the supplier should you drop consumption. because it's not always the case that you're going to be able to drop consumption without penalty. It's not how the market works. So you need to be really clear of the type of product you're locked into for a period of time. So when we sort of first had a meeting with Doug, and we did a conference call initially, the £100,000, we went to market and we looked at 5 or 6 suppliers, and they were in a range from 99,000 to 105, I think, at the time. As far as the thing, and at the top of the range was British Gas at 105, and at the bottom was N-Power at 99. Now, in most instances, when we go into the school scheme, you go straight to the cheapest. I'll go with the 99,000. The difference in the contracts are very marked in what they do and what they allow you to do going forward. If you look at the British Gas contract at one end of the market, the energy market is made up of, and the way your unit price is put together is in 2 elements. You've got the wholesale, that's the bit that's traded daily on the stock market, and that was the bit we had a problem with during the energy crisis. Currently, the wholesale market is around about 7 or 8 pence. That's what that would cost to buy the wholesale electricity on the market. The other element is called non-commodity costs, basically government taxes. There are 27 taxes in an energy contract. Currently, that's working out at about 13 pence. So 8 plus 13, they should 21p. That's currently where the market currently sits. When we got to 110 pence, which is where the market topped out during the crisis, 95% of that was the commodity and 15% was the government tax. The government tax hasn't fallen back in the same way, because governments don't usually reduce taxation. They tend to keep taxation quite high. And the taxation is there to pay for the infrastructure. Now, the way that the market puts a product together is it says, we combine those together. You could have a day or a night rate or a single rate, depending on what type of contract you've got. But companies will build protection into themselves and then put a cheaper price into the market. So as an example, the wholesale price, that could be fully fixed. In other words, it won't change during the lifetime of your contract. The government element, you can have fully fixed, or you can have it as forecasted. If it's forecasted, and this was the 99,000, it means during the lifetime of the contract, supplier has the right to reevaluate those forecasts and charge you extra. And they have every right to do that at any time, and even up to 6 years after you've left. That's the reality of how the market works. Now, on top of that, that particular 99,000 contract also had something called volume tolerance in it, which meant that you were signing up for a minimum usage. If you sign up for minimum usage, if we did drop the electricity by 42%, which is the aim, you will end up basically at best getting 20% saving. The other 22% you'll pay to the energy company, because they'll enforce the rule that says you will pay 80% of your contracted rate irrespective of how much you use. So it's really, really important you get the contract right if you're building a project around decarbonisation. If you don't get that right, you will end up costing your money. You can put solar on the roof and have no benefit from it. That is the reality. You'll save it in the contract, in the actual usage, but you won't save it in the contract. So just be mindful of what's been purchased for you, and be aware of what you're trying to do and link the two, because it is absolutely paramount. We see this time and time again in the marketplace, and there's some fairly hefty penalties that sort of sit in the space. And one of the key issues with when we spoke first today, we understood where the direction of travel that the school was trying to take in terms of energy reduction. It was trying to save money, it was trying to be more efficient in what it did. So it was really important to give a contract that had flexibility. The contract, there were no penalties in it. If you go to the big 6, your EDFs, your British Gas, your SSEs, you are unlikely to get any penalties in those contracts. They are dearer usually than some of the smaller companies on the market, but you'll get the protection that you could halve your energy overnight and it wouldn't be penalised. If the school was closed during COVID, you wouldn't be penalised. That is the reality of what is available in the market. So just make sure you link the contract. The other thing that we see time and time again, this was the challenge when we first brought to Doug. You get a bill each month, and then the bill says you've used so many units and there's a cost. What isn't on there is what's used it. And that's always the challenge, understanding what's actually is being used in the building. And when you look at your distribution boards, and you look at how your infrastructure is set up, it's understanding actually where the big spends are. And we put loggers on we use little loggers. We use a piece of kit called Panoramic Power. You may be familiar with it. It's provided by Centrica. And that kit just clips over the cabling. And that then sends us this pulsar signal, and it tells you how much whatever it's linked to is using. So in theory, every light in this room, you could have a sensor on, and we could tell exactly what each individual light is doing. So it just helps you to break down the actual usage, and then you can target where the big usage is in the school. But more importantly, also see what is being left on a Saturday, Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. So as an example of that, we've done a piece of work with a number of companies and schools over the years, and the kit highlights some really strange things. So as an example, we've been in a situation where a school lights up at 3:15 a.m. on a Sunday morning, lights up for 20 minutes, and then shuts down again. And you think, why is it doing that? But this kit could spot it. Nobody's on site at 3:15 a.m., so who's going to know? And it was literally when the business management system was put in, that's when they tested it. The test was never turned off. So if you look at doing that for 4.5 years, that adds to cost. So you don't know what you don't know. And this is one of the biggest challenges in linking the contract side with the long-term aim of where you're trying to get to. It's absolutely paramount you bring the two together. And we see time and time again in the solar world, the solar companies never look at the energy contract. They'll always make promises of what you'll save. They never look at what will the contract allow you to do, because you may not make the saving. And the challenge I think we're all going to have is if we go down the decarbonisation route, if we went there tomorrow, every building in the UK has what they call a KVA allowance. In other words, the grid gives it an amount it can use, and that adds up to that locality, adds back to a substation, which goes back to another substation. And at the moment, the grid is struggling. There's no two ways about that. If we went to EV vehicles tomorrow, we'd melt the grid. That is a fact. It just would not cope. So as you look to decarbonise, we're going to remove fossil fuels. Currently, 40% of UK usage energy is fossil fuels, still. That's the reality of where we're at. We only recently shut down our first our last coal power station. And actually, if you listen to the news this morning, there's a big debate now about incinerators. There was a huge piece this morning that actually burning plastic through incinerators is 1.75% more worse than using a coal power station. Who would know? We get to a stage really where there are lots of challenges in what we're trying to do. And what we've always said is if you think about your estate, and look at your estate, look at what power you've got and have a plan of what you're going to use in the future. It's really important in terms of building the KVA allowance, because we see time and time again also in the procurement market, companies coming to us in schools coming to say, I've got 150 KVA, I'm not using it, I'm only using 75, can I give away 100? Or can I give away sort of 25%? It will save me money. If you give it away, the grid will use it elsewhere. You will never get it back. That is the harsh reality of where we're at currently. So if you've got a high KVA and you're sort of 70, 80% of it, you will be using that over time as we decarbonise. I absolutely guarantee we're going to shift from fossil fuels, predominantly gas, to electricity. There is no real alternative in volume at this stage. Hydrogen is a long way down the line. And that's the harsh reality of where we're at. So the pressure on the grid is going to intensify over the coming decade. So be mindful of what you've got and think about what you're trying to do, and also make sure the contract is in line with it. Any questions?
What about the relationship with fabric first then?
Well, I think the key thing with all of this is that if you look at the core element of any energy contract, most of energy is lighting and heating. So if heating is the primary cost to schools in particular, it's absolutely paramount that you actually get the fabric right. Because the challenge within that is that we've seen governments come up with grants for air source heat pumps, but putting that into Victorian buildings just simply won't work. That is again, the harsh reality of the infrastructure and state we have. We'll have to make sure that the building can retain heat first. And one of the things I would say to all of you, if you're looking to invest in any of that technology, please engage somebody to do a heat loss calculation first on your building, to look at what it needs, and then engage people that know what they're doing in terms of fabric, so that it can actually make sure that what you're investing in will actually work. Because the thing we see a lot when we go around looking at the energy usage on a building is you go through one classroom, it's boiling hot, next classroom beside it's freezing cold. There's no logic to that in terms of, but that's often the issues with the challenges we have with quite old estates. And energy is such that everybody has to have an energy contract. There is no benefit to not having one. If you don't have one, the deemed rates are 40% higher than the contracted rates, so I wouldn't go there. It's not a smart financial move. But also make sure the contract is right. Because ultimately, again, we see in the school space often 5-year contracts. So that's a very common theme. The problem with 5 years is a long time in what you're doing with the building. So just make sure at the outset of that, when you're looking to renew, you've thought through what the next 5 years might look like in terms of usage, because you could actually have issues going forward in terms of cost for you and freeing up capital, which is key to any sort of reduction in terms of costs.
So why do we think the Department for Net Zero and SAILIX focus on removing fossil fuels rather than they will allow it to include fabric elements, but it's all about removing fossil fuels, isn't it? And, you know, heating technologies, it's not adopting the fabric first approach, which is more logical, because you're always going to have to oversize your system. If you're successful with a PSTS bid or whatever, it's always going to have to be oversized because the fabric hasn't been addressed.
So I'm Jason Turner from BCR Consulting. It's a similar consultancy practice to myself. And a lot of PSTS bids that we submit is very much any fabric improvement has less energy savings. There's a higher financial contribution that the school has to make. So it almost penalises you actually making the fabric improvements, and you end up, like this year, I'm submitting PSTS where it's solely really is focusing on going from the boilers to air source and doing the heating distribution, not looking at fabric, because then that's too much of a contribution to the school.
It's all pound and sword, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the biggest challenge.
It becomes a much bigger job, doesn't it, and more risky when you try and do a
I think one of the
job in one go.
I think I agree with you. One of the biggest challenges in technology is moving very fast. By its very nature, it'll continue to evolve very, very quickly. And you think about the mobile phone. 13 years ago, we didn't have the internet on it. The world's on it now, and it's the same in terms of any form of heating technology. It's trying to keep pace with where we're going. I think the challenge we have at the moment is that if you take the primary school sector in particular, it's a very Victorian sort of estate. And lots of old very thick buildings, very poorly insulated, have lots of issues in terms of boilers and so on, as Tim deals with. And what we see is that typically, if you look at the energy market, about 20% of all energy is wasted. At least that in terms of, so you think about it in bill terms, about a typical secondary school with 1,500 pupils will pay £500,000 a year in energy costs. When you take the gas electricity combined, the best part of £500,000. So it's a big spend. You look at the capital spends in businesses, it's a big spend. Getting that right is key. If you get that right and get the right contract in place and the right structure in place going forward, then you get to a place where you can control that cost and use that money elsewhere. And that's really what we're trying to say here today. Fabric first is absolutely key, but also importantly, get the energy contract right with it, because there's no point in doing one without the other.
At some stage, there's a cost, a financial cost. Yeah. I know that there's different balances here in terms of the carbon and energy cost. But for my clients, they'd love to achieve the carbon cost, but at what cost? Who's going to make the saving? Where's it going to come from? And therefore, they have to lead on. We can save the energy costs, and then the carbon is a dividend. It's an extra, isn't it? Unless government are going to pay for the difference between it, and at the moment, it doesn't seem to be that. So, for us, the advice that we feel is the most appropriate to schools is always to go fabric first.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
So I think that's teed it up quite nicely, to be fair, because it's kind of what we're going to talk about in a second. So we're Green Net Zero. We're a sustainability environmental consultant. Our skill set sits very much with decarb in buildings and reducing energy in buildings. And obviously across all the different sectors in the UK, there's different drivers for each one of them. We've got people that have got science-based target initiatives where their driver is carbon reduction. They've got a figure kind of against that that they need to achieve. Obviously, that's their driver. The public sector is completely different. It's all about reducing energy costs. Obviously, a nice byproduct of that, normally, is you also reduce carbon. But, as you've already mentioned about SAILIX, the driver for them is carbon reduction. The sacrifice a school might have to make is actually they're going to pay more for their energy bills at the end of it. Is it the right time to do it? Are there other things they maybe need to focus on first before they go down that route? And that's where we kind of come in and advise. We're in a really fortunate position with Doug. Obviously, all the fabric work that is quite costly and quite difficult to fund typically has been achieved through Tim with SIF funding. So we've now got buildings that are structurally sound, thermally much better performing than they were, and we've got a boiler plant that's been replaced that is obviously now performing a lot better. But the reality is, we'll kind of start on the boiler side of it really. Those boilers were sized 40 years ago that you just said have been replaced. Doug's already mentioned that his energy bills have come down through heating, but how much more can we optimise that? How much more can we understand the heat usage within the building before we start to look at things like heat pumps? There's no point in changing a megawatt boiler for a megawatt heat pump. You'll save carbon, great, but you're going to end up paying 3-4 times as much for your heating bills than you were previously. So we're trying not to do that. So we're going to go down a route effectively with him to optimise his heating system. A 1 degree C reduction in set points within a room reduces your heating bills by 8%. So it's trying to work out where we can get to with that. Now we're doing that in one way, which is hopefully going to be through digital twins of hydraulic systems. Digital twins for buildings is being talked about at education estates at the moment, but this is all about the hydraulics. How are your pumps set? What do they need to be set at? What are your heat emitters emitting? What's the temperature? What's the boiler going to operate at? How can we implement things like heat pumps at the end of it? How can we have a blend between the two rather than just taking gas boilers out and putting a heat pump in? Could we maybe consider putting a heat pump in there that's doing 80% of your heating load and a boiler then does 20%, which is a balance then that gives you cost savings on your heating bills and decarbonisation as well at the same time. So by doing this, we can simulate effectively what the outcomes of using these technologies are before we start to commit to capital funds to actually be able to put them in at the end of the day. I think we'll find out over the next sort of 3 or 4 years, especially with Salix, that funds have probably been spent in the wrong way that's left end clients with heating plant that's lovely and shiny and works at the end of the day, but it's actually costing them a considerable amount more money to run, which they're stuck with for the long term. So we're trying to go down that route now with Doug, and obviously things like smart TRVs, we'll be considering those down the line to understand exactly how individual rooms are performing, giving occupants the ability to turn the temperature up and down to make sure that they're getting the heat that they need at the end of it, and then being able to report back on that to actually understand what the heat demand of that building is. That's where we're going on that side. In terms of other technologies, these are kind of all the low-hanging fruits, really. We're trying to get to a point now where Doug can get some quite big savings from operating his building. Now, a natural place that we tend to go is lighting. If a school hasn't replaced their existing lighting with LED, it's one of the first things we always tell people to do. It's quite simple. You take out a compact fluorescent tube, light fit in, and replace it with LED. You get around about a 70% reduction in your energy bills for lighting. You get an improved environment for people to learn in and staff to be in, which is, you can't put a cost against it, but everyone's well-being and mental state is as important as ever these days. So we've done an assessment with Doug at the moment. Hopefully we're just about to kind of kickstart with that project over the next 12, 18 months. But it's about a £15,000 reduction in energy bills by going down that route. A byproduct, which John will be pleased about this one, is a 19-ton reduction in CO2. While that's not as important on the kind of bottom line, it's important to peoples, it's important to schools, it's important to the government, and the way that the UK is going at the moment. So that's one route we're going down. We're also starting to look at, because all the roofs have been replaced and they're structurally sound, we can now look at things like solar PV. Had we gone the other way around, we may have been in the situation where we can put solar panels on a roof and in 5-10 years we've got to take them back off to change all the roof coverings to put them back on again, which is just, what's the point? And there's no point in doing that. The cost that you probably, or the energy that you'll save from the initial kind of implementation of solar panels would be lost on having to put scaffolding back up and taking them back off, putting them back on. So we're also looking at that as an option as well for him. And it's about £27,000 cost reduction as well by doing that from his energy bills. But obviously there's quite a high financial investment that needs to be put in to do it. What we're trying to also do is use technologies that are able to be installed as a service. So this is something else that we're trying to do more and more and more in the sector, especially the school sector. There are technologies out there that are now allowed to be funded through it's not grant funding necessarily, but finance agreements, managed services agreements through the Academy's handbook. So LED lighting and solar PV are two things that we can now do as a service. So effectively, Doug will be paying a monthly fee, no capital up front for any of the solutions that we're putting in, but he will effectively pay for those products through the savings that he's making on his energy bills every single month. So he gets lovely new solar panels, lovely new LED lighting, no capital out of his budget's been used. He can use that to fund new buildings that he's obviously considering at the moment. So equally, that's just as important for us to start to look at. So beyond that, really, it then comes into how do we start to implement behaviour changes in the schools? How do we start to use the loggers that Steve's put on to understand exactly how energy is being used and what we can maybe do to start to reduce that even further? And that will then effectively be a controls strategy that needs to be implemented to make sure that heating plants being turned down at certain times of the year, lighting is being turned down when it's bright outside, making sure that lights will be able to be reduced in terms of their output, to make sure that the lux levels are the right levels for learning, and just kind of further sort of, well, I don't suppose how you put it really, but effectively just knuckling down on those quick wins and those kind of more granular energy reduction implementations that we can start to look at. It's kind of it really from our side. Have you got any questions at all? Or? Perfect. Okay, well, I'll hand over to John to talk about the carbon.
Sorry, just one question. For the PV,
Yeah.
are there any grants out there that you recommend for like schools?
So not really, no. There's obviously things like PPAs that you can go down the route with that, but the issue we've got for schools going down that particular route is they're stuck with solar panels for 15, 20 years that they're paying a fee for. It's not particularly flexible. So the way we tend to do it is the managed service approach that we're talking about, where a school might be in a contract for 5 or 7 years or 10 years potentially. They pay a fee for those panels, but at the end of that period, they will then own them or they have the option to upgrade them. Obviously, we've already alluded to the fact that technology is developing at quite a rate at the moment. There's even talk of sort of kilowatt solar panels coming out in the next 4 or 5 years. You don't really want to be putting panels in that you can't change when those types of technologies come out. So we tend to just push the managed service approach. Plus, they're fully maintained. It's peace of mind for the client. It's they get the warranties that go with it. But there's nothing else we see out there really in terms of funding. There is a huge lack of funding coming into the public sector to be able to do things like that are proven, which to me makes more sense to invest in something like that you know you're going to get a return on it, both a financial and a carbon reduction. Rather than sort of the public sector decarb scheme where it's all about carbon reduction. I think they've kind of skipped a stage to get to that point. They need to probably invest that money in other areas before they go down that quite a committed route, I suppose. So yeah, in short, no, not worry. I'm sorry.
It's very rare you'll get an actual grant of any description in relation to solar. What you're getting in relation to decarbonisation or into energy efficiency. And that tends to be where the commercial is and sits. And the government did have grants in that space for the commercial level. It was considering doing things in school in a similar sort of way, but it's actually obviously has a change of government. We'll see what comes out next. But it is always a very difficult. You'll never get directly for solar. You get it for what solar does. So it's actually how you dress it up. The grant system is always like that. The grant system in the UK is quite difficult because obviously it's quite regionalised as well as nationalised. So you end up sometimes just South Derbyshire, that had a grant for energy efficiency. The schools could actually appear, and that was only around for about 6 months and gone. So it was a small amount of money. So we have a very disjointed grant system. It's quite difficult to get around it sometimes.
There is pockets. There is little, like you said, there's pockets of funding available or kind of initiatives that are being considered in certain areas. So we know in the southwest, for instance, where Steve and I are both from, that's quite a proactive region in terms of trying to invest in projects that are ethical and sustainable, and it doesn't necessarily have to come with a return on the investment. It's all about doing the right thing and making sure it's being geared for the future. So there's more and more grant funds that are potentially going to come down the line, but they're more, when they say grant funding, it's more about a very competitive loan scheme that you would pay back over a period of time, but it's trying to make those funds available for people to do the things that give them the impact they need effectively. Yeah.
There is a company here today that we're lighting as a service.
Yeah.
It's the first time I've come across it, but like I say, they will maintain, they will monitor,
Yep.
they will do everything, they'll replace it all, and like I say, they'll look after it for the next 8 years, 9 years.
Yep. And I think the more that people have that being put in their schools, and the more people talk about the positive impact of that, the more that people will go down that particular route. I know that, like Dave's here as well, we're talking to him about lighting, and sometimes when you look at the cost savings that go against it, even with a lighting as a service, they're almost too good to be believable. So you sort of sit back and go, there's got to be a catch. There isn't. It's quite a simple route to go down. And I'm glad that you've got those details, because I would encourage everyone to go down that particular route, so long as you're using with a reputable installer and they're doing it in the right way and they will maintain it and they are quality products that are going in, then I would do it all day long.
This is where the log is coming from. You can put a log on your lighting, just see what you're currently using, what it's currently costing you, because it's quite difficult to break down your bill, isn't it? That's always the hard part of it. So the school says, well, I can't see that. So if you put a log just on the lighting and say, our lighting's costing us 15% of our overall costs, you then put in the LEDs, you can see the difference because you've got the same log on it. It actually highlights the actual savings straight away. And that often isn't done if people don't break it down to that level. But you're arguing at school level, the spend is this, but it's that little bit of spend, and we can't see it. It's not visible.
And equally on that note, and something I didn't talk about, should have done really, but obviously what we're doing is we're reducing the energy usage within schools or Doug's buildings. That then releases more energy, electricity that can be used down the line for other technologies. So a lot of the heat pump projects that are being put in need grid infrastructure upgrades. They need new incoming supplies. If we start to optimise the amount of electricity we're using in the building already, then we might not need to actually invest as much in doing those upgrades when you get to that point of doing it, which, you know, some of these are £100,000-200,000 of just getting grid upgrades to be able to do it, if you're even lucky enough to get them. So, correct. Yeah, good luck. Yeah. Exactly. So just trying to free up as much as you possibly can before you take this. I mean, it is probably the most difficult leap that we're going to take throughout globally, really. It's especially in the UK, because we're so reliant on fossil fuels for heating. It is the decarbonisation of heating is the most difficult bit. So reduce everything else first, get your fabric absolutely nailed on, and then when you come to size it, when you come to put it in, it's going to perform at the level that it should be. On a new building, they're all getting heat pumps put in there, and they're all working at 300-400% efficiency, no problem at all, and it's comfortable for the people that are in there. Old buildings, Victorian buildings that are throughout our school estate, don't have that luxury. So do all the other bits first, and then kind of get to that point down the line.
So just to reiterate the point that we talked about at the beginning of this, in terms of disaggregated amount of funding, it's siloed, it's not consistent, it's not coordinated. SALEX and certain public sector decarbonisation has been really cruel to schools. We have done appallingly in terms of our return. I don't want to get an arm wrestle with the NHS, of course I don't, but there are certain sectors that have done particularly well, and we've done particularly badly, bearing in mind that the school estate is the largest government portfolio in the country. We have 50.1%, and we get 15% of the funding. We've been Cinderella for long enough, hence the fact that opportunities like this is to say that we need more. I've traditionally taken my clients down the service of the operating group lease, simply because it's cleaner. There's effectively a proposal here. It says, this is the empirical evidence that we say that we can save you, this is what we're going to hang our hat on, take it or leave it. Going through a protracted, long, painful SALEX or public sector decarbonisation only to be told a year later you weren't successful, you've wasted that whole year of savings that you could have made. So, in some respects, the Academy's handbook, there was a kind of a leap forward this year in terms of them providing greater clarity on the ability to access operating leases for LED. There was a dearth of real evidence in terms of solar, so that is kind of still going to sit with trustees and board members to determine whether they are comfortable with taking out operating leases, still complying with the spirit of the Academy's Trust Handbook. There's some movements have been made, but I at the moment, obviously we still have some hope for 100 days into what the new administration is going to say, but at the moment the track record for schools being able to access proper funding to decarbonise has just not simply been there, and therefore they may need to look to the market, subject to the freedom that the Academy's Handbook is going to allow them.
I mean, we've been quite successful with the SDS. We've got 2 schemes at the moment, but like I said earlier, they were 2-year schemes, so we're still in the design stage at the moment. But we're getting to the stage now where we're completing the design and we're like, right, we'll have to present this to the school, but we're also going to have to tell the school that energy bills are likely to go up.
Yeah, who pays for that though? Yeah.
And to be honest, that's a classic, because I remember, Steve, when you first presented back to Doug in terms of the cost inflation that his new contract was going to be, and Doug saying to me, how do I go to the board and tell them what that hike was going to be? And yet, in retrospect, he had a bargain, because that figure was nothing compared to what was going around the corner.
Yeah, I did sign 30%. That's 30%. That's the gap among.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Cheers, thanks, James. Hey, John?
I'll be brief because I know we're running a little out of time. As has been alluded to by these fine gentlemen, and as someone who is the owner of a business called My Carbon, you can probably imagine that my lens is typically from a carbon point of view. However, this here is very much a tale of two industries. So when I work in the private sector, with clients who lease buildings or are able to buy shiny new buildings and fit them brilliantly from the start, we are helping them with their carbon management. And our system is that you need to calculate. You cannot manage what you haven't measured. You need to reduce. You need to then offset appropriately and correctly, and I can have that debate and conversation with anyone at length outside of this room, and then you need to certify. Now, that is fine when you have infrastructure that is equipped, well run, or you don't really give a damn about because you lease it and it's not massively your problem and it sits within a scope that isn't directly within your control per se. Obviously, I spend most of my time working within scopes. I know from the conversations I've had with Doug, they are not things that actually exist, usually in the education world, not currently at the minute. Now, my premise when I work with those clients in that private sector is that in the next 10 to 15 years, your carbon figure will be as crucial to you and needs to be as well known as your financial bottom line and your employee headcount. There is carbon taxation that is coming along. There is EU legislation. Steve and I were talking about this earlier. Big things called CSRD. Many acronyms that I could sit here and stand, kneel, fall down. I could say over and over and over. That is in the private sector. When you get to the public sector, and particularly with schools, when you have ageing buildings, going at things from a carbon lens is reductive and doesn't actually work particularly effectively. When I've spoken with Doug and many other schools that I've worked with, when you try and engage with people from a carbon point of view, you are often met with a or a and what does that give? I have a building here, I have X number of pupils. I'm not bothered necessarily about profit. You know, profit in the school sector is either a dirty word or hidden or, let's be honest, non-existent. So that is not a sort of origin from which you come from. Schools are under pressure, as we've had in this wonderful rolling conversation. They are under pressure to prove return of interest, to prove saving very quickly. If I go to a school and I say, yes, but we could figure out your carbon and then we'll look at reducing it, they will turn to me and go away. I have other things that I need to focus on. And that is entirely fine, that is entirely fair. It is why this approach, and again, we talk about decarbonisation. You asked a wonderful question. My answer was going to be politics. The reason why people go down the decarbonisation route as opposed to the energy route, it sounds fancy, it sounds lovely, it's often misguided. Working from what we would typically call the middle of the journey, backwards and then forwards, for this particular sector makes more sense. You need quick wins. You need to be able to identify where your cost savings, and energy is a really good way to tackle that, because energy is typically, even in most businesses, but particularly in schools, it is known. It is already measured. It is already something that people are yelling about and screaming about. It's something they're already worried about. Decarbonisation happens as an offshoot of that. So yay for me, that's great. But for the schools, the fabric first approach allows you to tackle those scope 2 emissions, your indirect emissions. They are what you're able to bring down. You've already heard the wonderful work that's gone on here. From that point, once you've then started to get a handle of those scope 2s, of those energies, that is when I typically tend to advise that you look at things from a carbon lens. So we've done a lot of work. I'll talk about the work we've done with Doug, but we did work with schools like Tonbridge Boys School and Channing and a couple of schools over in the US. They actually did exactly this. They, when we spoke with them, had already gone down the solar route. I wouldn't say as well, they hadn't worked with you guys, but they'd already gone down that particular route. They'd already gone down the energy route, the scope 2s. It was brilliant. However, they were then at a point going, well, what next? We've started to get a handle on our energy. We know where it is. We know how it's working. What do we do next? We've got funding. We've started to get more funding for this. We've started to be able to actually, we want to talk about the sustainability journey that we're on. What's this carbon thing that we need to do? And that's when we then worked with them and we started to develop for them their net zero plan and their carbon strategy. And that is a full all singing, all dancing. We went through, we got their ledger, we looked at all the emissions of student travel, international and within the country. And actually one of the things we were able to look at for them was actually the biggest source of their carbon emissions was their catering, believe it or not. What it allowed them to do as a school was to go and barter actually with their supply chain and say, look, here's our carbon footprint. of our carbon footprint, you as a supplier represent this amount, okay? We've made a promise that we're going to try and cut down our carbon and our energy. We need to go and we need to redefine the terms of our relationship. We need to have that conversation with you. That's great. They'd already gone down this journey, and a journey hopefully that Doug's going to continue to go on. However, you know, when I was speaking with Doug about this and I was talking to him about all these things, again, Doug came back and said, look, well, I'm doing this. I'm already on this energy route. I've already started to manage this. But if I still go and try and have this carbon conversation, people are still going to be a bit like, well, we've got this building where there's still, you know, the roof's being sorted out. We're still putting all these LED lights and stuff in. The problem is that schools need a carbon action plan within 2025. And exactly right, who knows when? Because the great thing about this carbon action plan is the details of what you actually need within it are light. They are almost non-existent. Now, I will tell you, from the experience of the private sector, I'll tell you what a feasible carbon action plan needs to have in it. It needs to demonstrate an understanding of initiatives that you have already undertaken, the challenges that you have had, potential initiatives you are going to look at, an understanding of challenges within your industry, and a very, very high-level roadmap. And what I mean by a high-level roadmap is, what are the steps that will be involved? Okay, I need to calculate my footprint. What does that roughly look like? When might I do that? What is a rough cost for that? Once I've done that, what's my next step? Well, you're probably going to look at a reduction net zero strategy. Cool. What does that involve? Fine, not a problem. It's just a number of bulleted steps. At this stage in this industry, what you need to be able to demonstrate is an awareness of the ability to begin managing your data. I've deliberately not said emissions there, by the way. Your data. Data around energy. Emissions is great, but it's around what do I understand as the footprint in energy and emissions of the estates that I manage. Okay. After that, you can look at things like offsetting, blah, blah, blah. The work that I did for Doug was literally, we had a 45-minute conversation. I produced for him what we call in the private sector the SQS, the Sustainability Quick Scan, but it is for the same, all intents and purposes, it is a carbon action plan. Doug now has that. It's a 12-page document with some lovely graphics in it that you can put in front of your board that says, this is what we've done, this is what we're working on, this is what we're aware of in the industry, these are the challenges we have, here's a roadmap that we will revisit as and when we need to once we have finished the journey that we are on. Now, that is the best approach for, you know, this entire sector at the minute. It is what will lead to decarbonisation in the right way. If you'd have done it the other way, trying to turn to your staff and students and go, we've saved 150 tonnes of carbon, they'd be like, great, it's cold, my building's cold and I can't see my textbooks because the lights aren't working properly. You know, it's the different way of doing it. Different sectors, different approaches. That was within time. Any questions?
No, just like I say, it's difficult because, you know, we keep pushing carbon reduction and talking about carbon literacy and educational lists, and the CEO who are obviously focused on academic excellence. They're not really, you know, taking any. It's got to take something like carbon tax or something like that to make them realise that, you know, the Paris Agreement, the 2050 targets are real things, and they've got to carry consequences if they don't achieve them.
But this is the thing, so like, to go back into the sector I spend most of my time in, even where there are mandatory influences that are coming in, there's still a lot of people burying their head in the sand. There's still a lot of people who don't know what they're doing. We were talking about this earlier in terms of, you know, one of our competitors are do-it-yourself calculators, and just the numbers that you get from there are fanciful, you know, in terms of actually the basics, where it is we often describe it to the people we work with as the wild, wild west. And more than anything, the most important thing at this stage is to try and figure out what you don't know. It's not even try and start doing something. What is the unknown for you? With pupils as well, you know, we talk to businesses about, well, if you save carbon, it saves energy, it saves your bottom line. With schools, it's a bit of an interesting one, because what's the output there? Is it the pupil experience? Is it the number of pupils? Is it the qualifications? In a carbon sense, it's trying to link those two up again and get them invested in it. And that is a real challenge.
So do we accept that the cost saving comes first? Is that not the priority?
In this sector, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so in answer to that rhetorical question, I'm guessing, is that the savings that can be, what is the outcome for the pupils or the school, is that those savings can be ring-fenced and reinvested back into the estate, which then, in theory, takes away further claims on the public purse in terms of the applications there. It's a bit like selling school land. It's an awful thing that people get very upset about. But there is a win-win to be had there, because the chances are that your local authority will have housing needs which they are unable to achieve, that there is available land there that's going nowhere, and if the local authority can release the land, perhaps it could be for key workers, certainly affordable. We're not talking aspirational housing here. The money that the school have had from the solar plant investment is then again ring-fenced and invested back into that estate. There is an organic win-win for everyone, and it's about those sorts of things that, unfortunately, at the moment, when a school transfers, when it leaves the relative protection of a local authority, it transfers with a hell of a lot of risk and with one arm tied behind its back, because it cannot access funding, it cannot access borrowing, it's not allowed to borrow. Even Doug will tell you that if he had more freedom, he would have had the confidence to borrow, to invest and make those savings. But at the moment, there is a disjuncture around that circle. And again, going back to the fact that there are all of these disparate local, regional funding streams available to decarb, but they're not connected to the first premise, which is actually making sure that the building condition is fit for purpose.
Well, it's the funny thing about that is, we see it all the time. You talk about we're talking about oil, and you look at, it's not even just the movement away from it. You look at the economic ramifications of the fact that most of the UK's pensions are tied up in oil funds at the minute. Actually, you would sink the entire UK economy the moment you move away from oil. It's funny that I'm being recorded saying that as someone who runs a sustainability consultancy, and we do need to do it. That's what we're working towards. One of the values, we talk about is pragmatism. We work with our clients in terms of it's about how do we walk the right pathway there in a case of you cannot just suddenly cease doing something. It has to be effectively managed in the right way. A lot of the businesses we work with, it's the same with Doug. I could have sat there when we were working with Doug and gone, no, you definitely need to measure your carbon footprint. Of course I'd love you to do that. It's a lovely, tasty piece of work for my business to go and do. But that's not the effective way to manage it down the journey, because it's not the right prioritisation of resources. We've got a client who, before they started working with us, they went and invested in they produce a lot of high-grade quality food. They went and invested in a lovely building, didn't speak to anyone about it, just went, we're going to move the building internationally away. It's a 3-storey industry building. We're going to kit it out. It's going to be fantastic in terms of all the tech that it's got in there. It will definitely save us money because it's cheaper abroad than it is in the UK. Except the problem is that it's a 3-storey warehouse. The food has to be prepared at an ambient temperature, and it's all on one floor. So you've got 2 floors of dead air that are currently being heated. So actually, and in terms of also where they've situated it, they've put it in a particular land where the fossil fuels out there are derived from some of the worst fuel systems you could possibly get. So, again, it's a case of you look at a lot, and you look at why they've gone down the decarbonisation route, the net zero, it's because you have these wonderful terms that people look at and go, if we put these terms on it, that'll be really nice and we'll go down it. And actually, that's not often the best way of teasing it apart and figuring out where your strands are. We have clients that we work with who their footprint is minimal. And they're like, well, we've been asked by, we're talking about this with Scope 3s, your Scope 3, your big suppliers are going to put pressure on you to say what your emissions are. We're asked for a net zero plan. Well, their carbon footprint's like 9 tonnes because it's too. Well, when we work with you, Tim, Tim works, out of his house mainly. Your footprint is nothing. You drive a car, which EV. There's nothing. You have no footprint. To turn around and be asked to have a net zero plan, it's of what? But it sounds wonderful. But actually, then that's when you look at things like offsetting.
Anti-slavery policy.
Yes, exactly.
I'm
Yes.
thinking not to enslave myself.
Yeah.
I mean, the grid's never going to fail during our lifetime for anyone against a net zero, is it?
No.
I mean, you talk about 60%, you reckon?
It-
I don't know, there's 60 or 40.
So what? We're 2024 now. 2030. So where our business is at the minute, say we are responsible for basically helping people understand what their carbon footprint is and then putting the right people in touch with the other right people to actually allow them to do something. We estimate that in the next 4 to 5 years, our business is going to suddenly go through the roof because you're going to get within 2 to 3 years spitting distance of 2030, and a lot of these companies have suddenly turned around and gone, hold on a second, we said we were going to do that thing there and we've done none of it. Without realising that it takes, even talking about the roofing, that's a 2, she said that's a 2-year thing to go and do that. That's a singular asset on top of another asset that you're trying to work at. You've got businesses, I quite like it currently at the minute when I see businesses walking back commitments. I actually, that makes me happy because what that means is someone like me or someone in that business has gone, that's not possible. And I'm actually going to take that back out of the public space now and I'm going to go and figure it out properly. We've got clients we work with in the textile sector in a country I won't name, should be able to go and figure it out, who'd applied for something called the SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative. That is a very ruthless, I like ruthless, it tries to hold companies to account to a standard publicly to make sure that their targets are validated and there are actual proper glide paths that are modelled that will actually show you to the decimal point of if you do this, it will reduce this. we had companies that signed up. If you sign up and you submit a letter of intent, you have 2 years to get a plan together. 18 months down the line, these companies turned around and went, oh, we haven't done any of this. And it's very public if you suddenly, they throw you out because they want to hold you to account. We're going to see that to 2050. Yeah, I love this 2050. The more you look at it, you go, why did 2050? Yeah, but why was it selected? Because it's in the middle of the century, and we suddenly figured out that on the IPCC paths that had been predicted that it was a real problem if we got there. It is a real problem if we get there. But the fact that everyone jumped on it and went down target routes with nothing is ridiculous. Yeah. Anyway, I could go at length, but yeah.
So thank you everyone for coming. I could actually obviously come around and introduce myself to each of you individually, given the numbers that were here, but thank you very much. It was small but perfectly formed. So in terms of the challenge, has anyone else got an alternate to Fabric First? Is there a better route to this? And if there isn't, why are we not doing it?
Well, I read conflicting evidence. I'm reading in journals at the moment articles that say that Fabric First approach does not work because it depends which hand you've got. If it's carbon reduction or energy reduction. If it's energy reduction, yes, we get our benefits of energy reduction, but taking that final step then to get to get rid of your fossil fuels and things like that. If you're sitting comfortably and you've reduced your energy and everything like that, are you going to make that final leap? If it involves massive SCA investment or something like that. So I'm playing devil's advocate, but like I say, I am seeing articles in journals these days that saying that Fabric First approach is not the best approach if it's on about carbon reduction. But yes, certainly from an energy and a cost reduction, which is what all schools want to see really.
But they are one and the same. And I said
they are,
that's the funny thing.
not.
But it's also because I think people worry that it's the politics of it. If I turn around and say, this is my business, if I turn around and say, I can't do carbon, I think people are worried that they'll be crucified by it. But energy reduction is part of it. It's scope 2. It's your indirect emissions. Your scope 1s are your boilers and stuff. I think it's the easy win that people want to go down. And again, I specified in this sector. There are different sectors. If your energy procurement is different, or you're working in an office and you lease that, then no, there are other things that you need to go and do first. Yeah. But in a school where you have these big buildings, which they are, if in an office you go into a WeWork and the office doesn't work, you all go home and you sit in your houses and you run your work, and theoretically your operational play still continues. In a school, if that doesn't, the pupil, we saw what happened in COVID, didn't we? For the operational integrity of a school to run a point, you need the asset to be functioning. And as we say, if the estates are aging, tackling those scope 2 secures that, allows it to run, and then you can deal with the carbon. Yeah. I know the journals you're looking at are also the same journals that complain that offsetting is inherently evil. It's often the Guardian because it's entirely carte blanche. That's the bad way to do it. It's shades of grey. There are different ways to do this.
Yeah. So offsetting will have to be on site in the future, is it?
Insetting.
Okay.
So it could talk for hours.
Indeed. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you very much. Cheers.
So a big thank you to everyone who attended my Fabric First roundtable event today, in particular to my fellow panellists, Doug Thorp, to James Smurthwaite, Steve Bolt and John Whittle. It was a great event, and anyone looking for additional support in terms of their estate strategy, ideally adopting a Fabric First approach, please come and speak to me at Warneford Consulting.